Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collins Guitars and Mandolins, each and every one built from the sound up in Austin, Texas. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. If you want to improve your playing, join me and thousands of other pickers getting better every day at pegheadnation.com. Hi, this is Matt, and you listen to Bluegrass Jam Along, the podcast for anyone and everyone who loves bluegrass. My guest on Bluegrass Jam Along this week is Eric Skye, and anybody who's been listening to the podcast for a while will remember he came on a couple of years ago to chat about his wonderful guitar duets record with Jamie Stillway, Over the Waterfall, and we had a fantastic conversation, and I've been looking for an excuse to get him back on, and I've found the perfect excuse. I invited him back to pick a record that he loves, and we were going to chat about that for the episode, and so he has, and we are. Welcome back to the podcast, Eric.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
And would you like to tell people what record you picked?
The Phillips, Grier, and Flinner trio album, which is just called Phillips, Grier, and Flinner, from Todd Phillips, David Grier, and Matt Flinner. Sort of a newgrass instrumental record from 1999.
And it's a really cool one. I remember we talked briefly about this when we had the conversation. This was sort of I remember you saying as part of your route into string band music, this was one of the key records that really got you hooked. And
yeah, absolutely.
And so, like, normally at this point, I'd ask how the record came into your life, but I feel like we've talked about that already. But just listening back to it and listening back to our last conversation, so many of the themes we talked about in that conversation about small group recordings, about kind of small ensembles and a few mics and tone and all of that stuff. Just, that's what this record's all about, isn't it?
You know, it really is. I have to tell you, I've been excited to talk about this record for a couple weeks now, but doubly so because this morning on my morning walk, I listened to it again. So it's just a few hours fresh in my brain with my big headphones, walking around the neighborhood like the nerd that I am. And yeah, I could sort of remember it with beginner's mind again, just like the first time I heard it, just the first opening track, Paint It Shut. It's just so good. It's so good on so many levels. And yeah, sonically in terms of that small group sound. And I mean, I haven't talked to them. I was thinking maybe I should, reach out to someone, like, tell me about the recording process. I know it was recorded in someone's dining room in Willow Glen, California, which is just like a little sort of part of San Jose. I actually fun fact, I went to Cupertino High School in the early 80s. And so I had friends in Willow Glen. I've made music in Willow Glen, so I kind of know that area. But yeah, it just sounds so simply recorded. I don't know if I want to digress into recording nerd stuff right off the bat, because it's obviously a lot more than just that. But the way it sounds, I'm sort of working on some mixing stuff this morning too, so I had that on my brain when I was listening to it, and just the way it's recorded is just so great. For example, it sort of strikes me as a LCR recording, which is when things are tracked hard left, hard right, and dead center. It's kind of the old way that consoles used to be, although it sounds like the right and the left are brought in a little bit, so that's sort of perfect for me, because sometimes when things are too wide, especially nowadays with headphones, it can be a little weird. But back in the day when you're listening through monitors, you get the crosstalk in the room, but in headphones it can be weird. Anyway, the fact that they're sort of, it just sounds like they're in a room and yet everything's so separate. Maybe I'll just leave it at that. And it sounds to me like everyone is just one mic on the guitar, one on the mandolin, and one on the bass. So just really, great, unbelievable tones and separation. And I love the sound of recording in the living room. A lot of my YouTubes and stuff like that are done in the living room. And in fact, I'm producing an EP for a singer-songwriter here in town that's going to have some guest artists and stuff, but mostly just 1 and 2 people. And I'm kind of hot on the idea of doing that in my living room for that reason, for that sort of intimacy and kind of farm to table kind of sound. So that's where it is sonically. Like I said, it came out in 1999, which is a really kind of a key moment for me. So I've been playing guitar now for, 54 years, something like that. So that was about the halfway point. And up until that point, like we said in the last time we talked about it, I really didn't come from this music. I didn't grow up, picking bluegrass in the parking lot or going to these camps or anything. It was just completely out of my wheelhouse. At that time, I was definitely an acoustic musician primarily still, but I was playing electric guitar. I was playing a lot of jazz and stuff. 1998, my first daughter was born, and that's when I stopped. Not that they're related, but that's when I stopped playing electric guitar completely, and I was getting more into acoustic. And someone, I think it was a student maybe, that asked me about learning Blackberry Blossom. And of course I said yes, but I had no idea what they were talking about. So I went to Amoeba Music in Haight because I was living in San Francisco, and I got a whole bunch of records in the bluegrass section. And this one was just sitting there. I think it might have been like a staff pick, or it just come out. So it was kind of more on display. I thought, well, that looks cool. And I bought it. And it reminds me, there's other records for me personally. I'm sure other people have their own, but as an acoustic fingerstyle guitar player who was kind of into the sort of California style in the early 80s, I remember a friend's mother had put the first 2 Alex DeGrassi records on a cassette tape for me, and listening to that with headphones is, probably like a 19 or 17-year-old or something. And that rewired my brain. And so did this. It just, I was expecting bluegrass, and I wasn't, super clear, what that was going to be. And this just, plus through my jazz brain, it just blew my mind.
There's something in that about those small ensembles, and there's a history of this sort of through the last sort of 34 years of string band music, is something that feels like a bluegrass band, but is not a full bluegrass band. And you get a sort of chamber texture. And there's something particularly interesting when there's no banjo, because banjo is such a strong kind of flavor, and one that I absolutely love. But there's an interesting thing that happens when you leave the banjo out.
Yeah, I agree. And just less is more in general. So something had to go. So it was, in this case, it was the banjo. But definitely when you get, more people involved, it's harder to kind of, kind of all move as a unit creatively sometimes in the moment. I mean, I don't know how, well, let me back up and say this, that when I was walking this morning, one of the notes that I made myself on my phone listening to this was how much it reminded me, even though there's probably no connection for most people, to the Bill Evans Live at the Village Vanguard. Because if you're a Bill Evans fan, you bought this, and you're a piano player, this is obviously a piano record. But if you're a bassist, or you would buy that record and think, well, this is obviously a bass album. And the same thing, listening to Scott LaFaro play the drums. But the truth is that album was not one of the first, but it's just probably most known as being this jazz record that's really just, it's not like the rhythm section backing up a piano. It's all 3 of them are just completely, the sum of its parts. It's all equally integral. And that's, for example, this is easily one of my very favorite bass records. I mean, the bass on this is just unbelievable. And, again, I'm not totally of the bluegrass world, so maybe your audience will forgive me if I say, I'm not generally a big fan of the bass in this music, as it's often played, just kind of beats 1 and 3, root 5, and just kind of thumping away. And on this record, you can hear, obviously it's not just, standard tunes either, but he sounds like Gary Peacock to me, like the growling and the sliding and the solos are some of the best, most lyrical solos on this record are really Todd Phillips solos, I think. So,
well, it's really interesting you say that, because I did a bit of digging around today, and he was talking about that period of meeting Grisman, and Grisman having this enormous record collection full of jazz records, and they would listen to jazz, and Tony Rice would listen to jazz, and he particularly called out listening to Bill Evans, and talks about kind of trying to fit some of that playing in, and thinking about syncopation, the leading tones, and some of the things that you don't necessarily get in bluegrass bass playing. And just Bill Evans, that band was the name that came out of that interview. We'll be right back with you just after this. The long-awaited Hill Country series from Collings Guitars represents a new voice in their acoustic lineup. Rooted deep in the bluegrass world, these new Dreadnought and OM models feature a strong fundamental tone with a dry, warm and woody character that's sure to catch the attention of players who hold the vintage instruments of the 30s in their highest regard. Watch world-class pickers Jake Workman, Kenny Smith and Bob Minner perform with new Hill Country instruments on the Collings Guitars YouTube channel, and learn more at collingsguitars.com. This episode is also brought to you by Peghead Nation, the home of roots music instruction. With 65 streaming video courses for guitar, mandolin, banjo, fiddle, dobro, bass and ukulele from some of the leading names in acoustic music, Peghead Nation has something for every picker. You'll learn the tunes and techniques you need to join in at jams and play the music you love, plus advanced techniques like improvisation, theory and ear training. Your first course is just $20 per month, and you can add more for $10 a month. Sign up for any course and get your first month free with the promo code JAMALONG, all one word. Join thousands of other players, including me, who are advancing on their instruments and having more fun playing the roots music they love at pegheadnation.com.
yeah, I've told students a lot, as a great listening exercise can be to listen to the Village Vanguard, and what I'm going to say would apply to this record equally, and maybe listen to it like 3 times in a row. If you don't have that kind of time, you could just pick one tune, right? And preferably with headphones, because you're more immersed, and just little sensory deprivation is good. And yeah, listen to it 3 times, and listen to it and just as best you can with your, aiming your attention, the little spotlight of your focus on just the guitar. If you're a guitar player, this will not be a hard task. And then the second time, go through it and just try to really, put your spotlight just on the mandolin, and just, try to have that perspective. Let's hear how he's, it'll be easy to get pulled into the bass solo or the guitar solo at that time, and yet stay with, whatever kind of clever, sometimes in this case, very minimalist sort of accompany there might be. And then you go through it and, another time, and you're the bass, and that's a very powerful exercise. And for an album like this, it's something, where you can get a really, really deep appreciation for it. And again, an album that maybe where there's rhythm sections just kind of holding down the fort, or, recorded separately, sort of, God forbid, I think, that maybe that is cool too in its own way, but not quite as satisfying. It's that interaction. You can hear the listening, if that makes sense, or you can feel the listening. And this album is just so, it's such a wild journey of that, just from start to finish.
Yeah, and that's also really interesting, just that sense of 3 instruments, and you've got the bass and you've got the guitar. But once the guitar is soloing or playing melodies or whatever, there's suddenly a big space. And listening to the myriad ways that Matt Flinner approaches that, and minimal but chord voicings, and the things he chooses to do behind that. And there's bits where him and David Grier are interacting in a kind of interplay fashion, where they're sort of both backing each other up, soloing at the same time, and the textures, and you hear all that in a trio record so clearly. But the range of what he's doing behind those guitar parts is just texturally beautiful, isn't it?
It's gorgeous. Well, first of all, I should say, Matt Flinner, just absolute, hero, just a tune writer for one thing. Just great tune writer, and his just that really warm tone. Anyway, I'm just a huge fan of his mandolin playing in general. But yeah, absolutely. We might have talked about this before. I know when I mixed the June Apple record that I made with Tim Connells, was sort of my entrance into this world, playing fiddle tunes. It's so great. the sort of relationship sonically between the guitar and the mandolin, because they can both be kind of playing really hard too and busy, but they're in such different universes that it's really easy to kind of keep them separate, both in terms of like EQ and, not being a big mess, but also in your attention, right? And you can just sort of move back and forth in a really neat way, those two in particular sort of complementing each other. But yeah, the interaction between those two is just, but it's really all three still though. Yeah. There was one, I couldn't remember which one it was. I should have made more detailed notes, but there was one part where Grier is soloing and Matt is just like playing like one harmonic, it's just whatever it needed. Maybe it was an E note and he's just playing that harmonic for a second or two. So it's almost not playing at all, but just some little thing there. And I'd love that. To me, that's the little goosebumpy moments in albums that I live for.
Yeah. And it is definitely like a proper trio record. There's 9 tracks on it. They wrote 3 each. The band, for want of a better name, is called Phillips, Grier and Flinner, but it's like if you listen to the track listing, it's Flinner, Phillips, Grier, Flinner, Phillips, Grier, Flinner, Phillips, Grier. 3 tracks each.
I love that.
Same
love
order.
That.
Like,
yeah.
They just, and they sort of talk about it being. There's a quote from, I presume it's from a press release when it came out, but I found it as part of a review of the record, and it was never a conscious decision to do an album together. Everything we were doing at the time just seemed to lead us in that direction. The only concept for the project was that each of us would bring 3 original tunes and the rest of the trio would help shape the tunes into a spontaneous musical conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. I think for the listener, following along, with the tracks, knowing that order of the composer is just so great, right? You can just really, I don't know, there's just an added fun thing. And, that was not lost on me. I think 10 years ago, I made my duo record with Mark Goldenberg, the Artifact record in Los Angeles, which is one of my favorite things I've ever been a part of. And we did, inspired by this, I mean, the music's not remotely the same thing. It's a completely different thing. If you guys check it out, it's long and weird and totally different kind of music. But I flew down there and I had 4 tunes. I had 4 pieces of paper with me. He had 4 pieces of paper with him. And we decided to just put them on a music stand in between us. And the whole thing's one just long, continuous take. We might have gone pee at some point in the middle, but it's the first and only time I've ever went out to lunch. We're like, wow, I think we made a record, but it was that same thing. Every other tune, I think maybe the first tune was, Mark and then me and then Mark and then me. But I was definitely inspired by that.
It's like that, the Strength in Numbers record, where basically each tune is a different combination of 2 people out of the. I love stuff like that, and it's things like that I think we miss these days with like physical product and having some sleeve notes and having it. And there's not much. Like I dug out my CD of this record. There's not much on there. But it tells you who wrote the tracks. And it's a lovely little thing on the back. It says, Phillips, Grier and Flinner let the listener in on a musical conversation filled with dazzling tones, rich new melodies, spontaneous interaction, and a sense of depth and breathing room. An audiophile's delight and a joy for all lovers of acoustic music. And like the word conversation, the word breathing, and the word audiophile, that sort of tells you the entire intent of this record, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's written on the back. I don't have the physical album anymore. Oh, wow. Yeah, so it's funny. So this is, like I said earlier, I literally went to the record store to get just some bluegrass stuff because I needed to kind of get up and running on it for whatever reason. And I grabbed this because of the way it looked, And I guess that still happens. I might do that on Apple Music now that I think about it. But that was just so exciting, to just... I don't know when I put it on. I don't remember, so long ago, 26 years ago. Oh my God. But at some point I'm just like, what is this? And I put it on and just, that experience is something I definitely miss. But, now that you read that from the back, presumably I read that and that's a heck of a, that would have sold it to me for sure. All of those things.
It's, I don't think you need, kind of explanations or programmatic notes or anything to enjoy music, but I love having a little guide as to what to listen for, and I love having being just taken on a little journey somewhere with music as well, because unless you really overwrite stuff like that, you can't ruin the music. And it's just a little spotlight into where to start, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that there was no, video or anything like that, that also lends itself to that more immersive experience. Another thing I remember from my walk an hour or two ago was just how oftentimes I'll tell people like the three Grier tracks, or maybe I should say the two that really stand out to me a long time ago in Car on Fire. I still, like 26 years later, will tell students like you just got to listen to this. So listening to Car on Fire again twice this morning, I'm like, this really is really one of the very best guitar solos I've ever heard. It's just so brilliant that I almost don't even like saying guitar solo. It's just this great creative expression. It's just this amazing moment. And kind of going back to the jazz thing, it kind of reminds me, and this is also a really big stretch, but it kind of reminds me of Jim Hall, where he's really playing with longer threads of ideas here. It's like clearly an idea machine, and I love that. But they're longer threads, I don't know how to say this. This is another thing where, forgive me, audience, because I still like to say I'm a little outside this world, but, guitars taking solo in this music seems to be a relatively new thing compared to other styles. And a lot of it, can get a little samey, I've sort of deliberately like not tried to learn any Tony Rice stuff, just because, it's almost like a little bit like the Django thing, with that era of jazz, right? It's just really easy for that to become the dominant vernacular. And Grier just stands out to me still. It's just being so original. And, part of it is his way of playing guitar, which we can kind of dissect a little bit, but it's more than that. But probably the main thing, and this album really shows it to me in a way that's more, more obvious and more interesting to me than maybe some of the sort of standard fiddle tunes, is these longer threads. And that in that solo, Car on Fire in particular, but really any one of these for sure, if you listen to it multiple times, it's just that. And then it's also like texture and playing with time. I remember I tried to transcribe a little bit of it, which turned out to be really, really, I gave up on it and partly because I don't want to try to play this. And first of all, I'm not capable. Like I'm not at this level. I can't play that. But it was just sort of interesting to try to understand like what was happening rhythmically. And then the cross picking and blah, blah, blah. But it's just a gorgeous solo, and it kind of comes and goes. It's sort of like there's almost like a part one and part two. Kind of Matt kind of comes back in kind of a response to what he just heard, and it's sort of like a little interlude or something coming back to another melody, and then the second solo kicks in, and it's just so good, right? And then I love it when this happens. So then it just sort of goes into another gear. You're like, oh man, wow, we're still going. And then it kind of goes into another gear. It's just really a great little ride and an incredible lesson on just creativity and theme and development instead of cut and pasty kind of ideas. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's good. There's definitely a bit in there where he's really playing around with perceptions of where the time grid are. And like, I love that. And then it's got, like you say, some longer thought processes. And then it like gets to a point where he just does the bluesy thing, like, which is not there for most of this record. And there's even probably a couple of recognizable bluegrass licks in there almost, but it takes it to a place your ear hasn't been in the first 6 tracks of this record yet, but because it's quite a long track as well. And it reminded me a bit of, and I was trying to work out why it reminded me of this, because it doesn't really sound like it, but it reminds me a bit of Raining at Sunset off Chris Thile's All Who Wander Are Lost. And I think it's what you're saying about that slightly longer threads that take their time to come to fruition, rather than just short statements. And there's something about them, they don't build in the same way. They're not melodically similar, but it made me think, like, it almost tricked me into thinking it sounds the same as it. So I then went back and listened to the Thile track. I was like, no, it's not. But it just immediately made me think of it. And maybe that's why it's that sort of...
It's a similar experience. Yeah. But you're right. It's a completely different ride. Yeah. It's, it's pretty incredible stuff. And it was great to hear it again this morning. I don't know why. I guess, morning listening is always good if you can, but I was just kind of in beginner's mind again. I just sort of had a glimpse of, and I was excited because I knew we were going to talk about it, what it was like to hear it for the first time. And what you said at that point, and other tune at the point in this solo, but in other ones too, where there's some of the bluegrass vernacular, or whatever, that was so new to me, I mean, I had tone poems at that point, and I wasn't, completely ignorant of bluegrass music, but I was a year away from signing with a small jazz label, that was kind of my world. And then also I sort of had another foot in, like I said earlier, like fingerstyle acoustic guitar. But yeah, this was a new thing for me. Right. So to hear that pop up in the middle of it too, it was really exciting stuff.
And you talk about those 3 Grier tracks, and there's something, and it's similar, like the Flinner tracks, and it is 2 of them particularly, like Paint It Shut and Gilbertson Road. Both of them are really playing with this fluid sense of where the downbeat is. Yeah. And like, I'm pretty sure that Paint It Shut is just in 4, but it desperately tries to, desperate is the wrong word, but like it really tries to show you that it's not, and it takes you around that bar line, and it just deposits you in a slightly different beat, which the bass playing is like really crucial to how that lands and where it's. But then also Gilbertson Road, it's a really kind of slippery thing to count. And on both of those tracks, there's a point where it goes from a reel into being in jig time, completely unexpectedly, just for a bit.
Yep. Those are in my notes this morning too, because I had sort of, and this is one of my main points too, is that I'd sort of know all of that, but sort of had forgotten about it too, is these sort of time changes. And I love it when there is time changes and stuff, but it's not kind of weird angular music that, like, it's just organic for want of it. I know it's thought out, but for want of a better term, it's sort of organic. It's just sort of happening. And you could listen to it a bunch of times before it even occurs to you, like, oh, like you just said, it goes good from a reel to a jig or something like that. But it just sort of very naturally relaxes in places and stuff. But it is very mathematical, and it's very tight. Like the sense of time on this is incredible. And you can tell it's 3 guys in someone's dining room. They're not sitting there with click tracks and headphones on. And this is, it could have been recorded to ADAT, but I'd like to think maybe it was recorded to tape. But either way, it wasn't done in Pro Tools and put on a grid somewhere. So this is just, really tight, rhythmically, like together tight, and yet feels kind of loose and relaxed. And yeah, there's points in there too. And I might be mixing this up in my head, but where there has these sort of half note triplet things where it just sort of feels like it's, it kind of reminds me of, there's some John Bonham drum fills that kind of do that, which also in a roundabout way kind of remind me of the Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon movie. And it was like sort of the first kind of karate or kung fu movie or whatever, where the fight scenes and all of a sudden they're kind of like floating in the air for a second and they come right back down and keep flying. I love that kind of feel. It's just like a little time out of body for a second. And there's some of that in there in the phrasing, but there's some of that in Grier's Car on Fire solo too, like you said, where he's just kind of really like like I said, I tried to transcribe it a little bit, and it's like, okay, this is way, way above my pay grade to try to figure out where the downbeat is. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. I'm sure he's not thinking that way.
And it's really interesting with this kind of, I say this kind of, like there's loads of records like this, but there's definitely a thread of sort of instrumental, original string band, kind of progressive, whatever you want to call it, stuff that goes back to kind of Grisman. And some of it sits definitely at the end of these are like composed fiddle tunes. They're just original fiddle tunes, and we play them and then we take some breaks. And then you get to the other sort of more chamber sort of end of it, and some of the like Baylor and Edgar and Mike Marshall and that side of it as well. Well, there's still clearly some improvisation going on, but there's definite structures and composition as well. And this is a record that feels like it's right in the middle of that. Like there's clear tunes and there's lots of improvising, but there's always a line that is being passed around and held by a couple of people at a time, and somebody else comes and joins them there. And, you know, I suspect there's a lot of improvising, but the textures and it's an extraordinary balancing act, really, given what I suspect the approach to. Like, I read some of Matt Flinner about it, and he was talking about both David Grier and Todd Phillips. Said that I've taught him a lot about how to approach music as playing in the moment, and trying to find the moments you never see coming. He says this, he says, if you try for it, you never actually get it. Instead, you provide the opportunity for it to happen and you make the most of it when it does. David especially will deliberately not play something the way he played it the night before, but try fresh avenues every night to see where they take him. I think his attitude is that repeating an idea that originally happened spontaneously takes the spontaneity out of it, and you can hear the difference. He's constantly looking for that next bit of magic that comes unexpectedly, and then he moves on. And that's a lovely description of what's happening.
Oh, that's fantastic. By the way, you did way better homework than I did. Well, the listening was really good, though. That's how I heard it, and I feel like to some small degree, I've had that feeling, and it all falls under the heading of just like really listening and really. And listening is a big word in music. You know, it's more than just hearing. You know, if anyone who's been married knows there's a big difference between hearing and listening, and it's really about attention and just staying with it and being in it. And that's what I hear. Like I was saying, the record, the Artifact record I made with Mark Goldenberg was, you know, we had pieces of paper in front of us. Like we each wrote out like the themes and the chords, and then the solos just sort of happened. And I'm imagining that that's how this went down, you know, because these are sophisticated tunes and there's breaks in time and stuff. But yeah, you can hear the improvisation is the main thing. So it's that perfect middle ground for sure.
It's the really interesting concept is, you know, I started having these conversations on the podcast with musicians, and I didn't expect to spend as much time talking about the most important thing that people who are playing music are doing is actually listening to each other. It's not like what you play is very, very important, but what you play can only be as good as your ability to put it in the right place, if you know what I mean. And so I talked about Tony Rice for hours for the Church Street Blues thing a couple of years ago. And everybody talked about how much he listened. And just so many people have mentioned listening as the chief job of being a musician.
And it's hard. You know, there's this sort of prior condition that you have to get to. You know, you have to be, and this is the hard part. This is the part I struggle with. Like, you know, playing like it doesn't matter when it does. And so, you know, this record might not have happened the same way had they woke one of them even maybe woken up on a different side of the bed or something. You know what I mean? Because there's times when, at least for me, I can only talk about my experience when it's, you know, it's hard. You can be distracted and not be in that place where you're, because this kind of listening is like, I was joking. I was on Jamie Still has a podcast too, Guitar for Introverts, and I was just on it. And we had just played a gig the night before, and we haven't been playing as much. And we had this gig, and I thought it went pretty good. And we were both talking about how exhausted we were, and it was because it felt like we were playing tennis, but there was like 3 balls. You know, you have to be so in it. You know, and some days it's harder to be there than at others. And some people seem to be really, really good at it. You know, some of the people I played with, like, I keep mentioning Mark Goldenberg, my duo partner in Los Angeles, because he's such a, you know, heavyweight and that sort of, you know, having played with Jackson Browne and people like that. But also Adam Levy is another guy I've played with, I like a lot. And I'm crazy about Adam, and we've we've done some duo house concerts and stuff. And he's another one where there's something about those session guys in particular that just, I like to joke with them that's like they're missing a chromosome, like an assassin, like, they can shoot you in the head and eat a sandwich kind of thing. Like I've just been in Mark with so many situations where it's just nothing riles him. And he's always in the zone. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. And the same thing with Adam and a couple other friends that I've gotten to play with. And that zone is what I'm talking about with that sort of that prior condition, where you can really just listen and react and stuff. And, we've all been that way in literal conversations with people, if you're talking with someone who's a really good listener, not just thinking of what clever thing they're going to say next while they're watching your mouth move. That's what this is really sort of about, if that made any sense. I don't know.
No, but I think that's really interesting because you talk, music and conversation and language as a metaphor is something that comes up a lot. And it is easy to fall into that thing of conversation being about broadcasting rather than receiving. And it's like, it's something I've had to learn with the podcast is the way I've come to it in my sort of own space is this idea of I try and treat these conversations like I'm playing a fiddle tune with a musician who the audience is paid to see. So my job is to get them to play something that they've not played before, that is interesting and is cool, but not like it's not. And I can help with that, and I can interject, and I can have a bit of a supporting role as an accompanist. But the other person who is the guest, who is the name on the episode, is generally what people are tuning. Do you know what I mean? And there's something really good about that. It's a really a really interesting space to inhabit, almost like I'm playing guitar along to somebody playing a tune.
Yeah, great analogy. And in that analogy, I agree with everything you said, and you probably agree with that. And you can also push people a little bit, into a different direction. Like I'm sure you've had some interviews where people maybe, you've just felt like, wow, this is getting monotonous, or they're just, I don't know, whatever, reading from a, press kit or something. And you have ways of sort of, motivating them or taking them into a different direction and stuff. And, that's a fun part about listening too. And by the way, if you're just sort of reading your questions off a piece of paper, you might miss all of that. Right. I liken that to accompaniment too. I'd love trying to, when I'm playing a duo gig with Jamie or something, and it's Jamie's really playing great solo. I mean, what's going through my mind is, how can I support her and really make her look great right now, sound great right now, but also, she's got a sense of humor and she's pretty fearless. So I can kind of push her a little bit into a different direction, kind of play with the time or the dynamics or whatever. And it's fun to hear her reaction. And that's the theme of today, right? That's why I went on and on about like these jazz records, the trio records, or some of these duo albums that I love so much. They all have that. That's what I love. That's the repeated listening for me. It's like a little adventure. I mean, it was an exciting ride this morning to go through this, and really, I've heard it so many times. It's one of it's definitely like in my sort of top 10 albums, like an oracle that I'll just come back to and just kind of, it's very nourishing. It's like, I don't know, Joni Mitchell's Hijira or Ahmad Jamal live in Paris, or Miles's Kind of Blue. I don't know. I could go on and on. There's that Gillian Welsh and Dave Rawlings, The Harrow and the Harvest. I've listened to that a lot recently. Americana from Bill Frisell. These are like always on my phone, and I'll listen to them in their entirety. And then I'm again, just nourished from them, challenged, excited. Yeah.
Well, I love that idea of you sort of saying about if one of the guys had got out of bed on the wrong side, the record would be different. And it's the same thing, like a record like this particularly, or something like Kind of Blue. It's an exciting thought that if they'd gone into the studio a week later, like 70, 80% of the record would probably be different in some way. And that's exciting because you've caught a moment. and there's something in that even though this happened 26 years ago or whatever, like you are in that room with them for as long as you've got.
Yeah, the more time, absolutely, and the more time that passes, the more you can appreciate it, because you may know. I mean, I don't know that much about these guys per se, but a little bit, but you might know more about them and who they were at that moment and where they came from. You mentioned Kind of Blue, and that's an album I'm very familiar with. I have that's something that I recorded the whole Kind of Blue record on as a solo guitar thing back in, I don't know, 2012 or something. So part of that process was really listening to it a lot and reading it a lot. And I just love the thought of, especially like maybe Cannonball Adderley. And just at that time, I can hear, you just imagine what his reaction was to playing on something like So What? Like, this is a guy who's like, grew up playing like How High the Moon and, all these tunes with tons of chords in them. And then to have like probably Bill Evans explain to him, no, it's like 16 bars of D minor and just stretch out and do whatever you want. And, again, like that's a record that you can hear, particularly that tune. You can hear those guys trying to figure out like, what am I going to do over it? And the answer is something amazing and brilliant, because that's who they were. Or you can hear like when Coltrane comes in and it's just like this unbelievably confident, strong, voice. And, but that was so new to them. And, knowing the history of that music and them and what led up to it and everything, you really gain a ton of appreciation for it. And, that comes with time. But it's just one of those albums when you can hear that, you can, again, hear the listening. I don't know. I'm trying to think of a better way of saying that, but.
Yeah. And it's funny, that thing of context informing the way you listen, what we haven't talked about yet are the 3 Todd Phillips tracks. And they are like the most sort of Grisman sounding tracks on this record. There's a clear California, string band element going on in there. And that's only natural when you know that that's the band that he came out of, and he played bass and mandolin in that band. And it's not like Grisman tunes, but there's definitely a nod to that in there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's interesting how similar they all are too, in a way, right? I mean, they really, the 3 different composers, writers of tunes, I don't know what the right term is, but they all work together. It all sounds like, I'm sure to the lay person, it just sounds like, maybe one person wrote all of these tunes, but you also hear the separation. I don't know, that's also because it's similar instrumentation and approach and everything. But yeah, similar writing styles. And yeah, I definitely hear more Grisman in that. But it's not obvious, it's not super obvious. Like when a lot of with the Grisman stuff, I hear a lot of the, there's a lot of Django in that to me, and there's definitely not a Django hit in any of this. This is a little more, especially thinking of Todd Phillips tunes, just like, I don't know, like they're kind of minor blues in a way, more modal jazz or something. Maybe I'm just stuck on that this morning, but yeah, they're really, really strong. They're all 3 just really strong, and that's why I love this album. For me personally, I don't want to say more, or I'll just say very differently than the second album that they made, which I don't have in front of me at the moment and haven't listened to in a while. It's also mind-blowingly amazing and brilliant and everything. But it's exactly the opposite. It seems like they all chose covers. Like there's some Hendrix tunes, there's Bill Monroe tunes. There's 2 McCoy Tyner tunes, or at least 1 McCoy Tyner tune that inspired me on my Ballads and Blues record to do that tune. Search for Peace, which is just stunning. Afro Blue is on there. So it's an album of covers. So, I mean, I digress. It's a different album, but it's just interesting. This one being all originals and that one being all covers is kind of a fun appreciation thing to go back and forth.
Yeah, and I sort of chose not to go and listen to that record while I was prepping for this. But what I did kind of out and flick through a bit is there's I don't know if there's a bootleg of Grier and Thile playing together in 2000 at the Prism Coffee House thing.
I know it really well. Yeah.
I found myself going to it after I've made that sort of strange Raining at Sunset connection, just to kind of hear Grier improvising with another improviser. And I was just curious to see if any of the tracks off this record made it onto that set list, to hear them played in a different context. And they're not. None of them are on there. But it's just such a fascinating live recording, that.
That's, yeah. Someone gave that to me years ago. They sent me on 3 CDs because it's that long. Yeah, they should release that at some point, I think. It's just so brilliant. I think I heard David once say that, like, and it's true, the way it's mixed, it's a little, the mandolin's a little hot, and presumably, I haven't listened to that forever, but it's mono, and that's baked in the cake. And although now with all this sort of technology they're using with the Beatles of separating mono tracks, it could be done. Anyway.
It's probably probably slightly more financially worthwhile to do it with the Beatles.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But anyway, yeah, that live session is that's another really incredible one. I mean, it's more hot playing and stuff. You can also hear Chris Thile just sounds, he's young, like the enthusiasm levels, like through the roof, the energy level, the tempos in some cases are just really through the roof. And you can hear Grier just like, all right, let's do this, and rising to the occasion. But some of the tempos on that are just, it's way beyond me. But yeah, that same sort of interactive thing is incredible on that.
I was curious, you were saying about, I listened to this record on headphones today as well, and curious because you were sort of saying it almost felt like you were hearing it with sort of beginner mindset again. And was there anything that came out of it that surprised you, or is it just that sense of feeling like you were hearing it for the first time again?
Yeah, again, I think because I was excited to talk to you about it this morning, that I, was kind of geared up for it, and then listening to it with headphones, in that mindset, it just reminded me that first time I heard it, and again, it was so new to me, just like stylistically to hear this stuff. Yeah. And then also just, more and more as I'm getting older, I'm doing more and more production and mixing and recording and stuff for people. So I'm hearing it even more in those terms. And this is just a great sounding record. It is also a reference track for me. So for people who do this kind of thing, we'll usually have a bunch of these, just collected like in different styles or whatever, just in one file that we can kind of go back to. And so if I'm mixing something, even if it's not, it really isn't going to be like a trio like this. If it's just an acoustic guitar or something, or I just remix something for somebody who actually had a Weisenborn, but it was a harp one. So it had like all these extended bass and treble, whatever. And this would have been like a record that I might have worked on a little bit, and then stopped, and then listened to maybe this album, or I have a couple others, as kind of a palate cleanser. Because sometimes you can just listen to it for like 30 seconds or something, because that this is a record that you love it in your car, you love it in your headphones, you loved it at your old house, you love it at your new house. It just always sounds good to you. So if you kind of go back to that as your sort of measuring stick, and it's still amazing. I feel like I'm getting better at this, after all these years, but I might listen to something like that for a second and then go back to the project that I'm working on and realize, oh my God, I've been going down this rabbit hole of fill in the blank, brightness, or, too woolly sounding or something, and then having that little palate cleanser. Anyway, that's what it means, for an album to be a reference track. And this has always been one of those, particularly because it sounds like mono guitar in a ensemble, and that's sort of one kind of recording thing that I might need to reset my palette to, and maybe in another case it would be like a solo guitar recording where it's stereo, and that's like a different thing that I would need to dive into for a second to go to. But this is one where I remember long time ago, the intro, that's the track number 3, the first of the Grier tunes. Beautiful tune, just beautiful tune. And the opening guitar part is just so great. That's just a great, I mean, it's a gorgeous piece of music, but it's also just sonically beautiful. And so I learned it. I learned just the first few bars, and then I tried to record it, with mono. I might have even played along with it in headphones so I got the timing right so it wasn't too different. And then I might put that next to the original, and I'm just trying to match it. And I know I'm not going to match it. That's not the point, right? This is a common exercise in the sort of mixing world, right? But the process of matching it, you're going to learn stuff like, well, I thought this was wide, but it's narrow. I thought it was bright, but it's not. I thought it was close mic'd, but now I realize it's not. Again, you're not going to get there. I don't even have a dreadnought, but the process is going to be enlightening. And it was. And I did that for this one. And then also the first track, I think it's called 1940s on this solo Julian Lage World's Fair record. I think it's like a tune down. Anyway, that's another amazing, brilliant oracle for me to go to. And I happen to really like that recorded guitar sound. So that's another one where I've gone that extra thing of actually learning a few bars. You don't want to do like a whole giant tune. You really just want little snippets, because after about 4 or 5 seconds, you sort of forgot what you listened to, like your actual ability to sort of A/B audio. You really want it to be super short, and you want it to sort of loop. Otherwise, you just get sort of taken in it, and you forgot what you were doing. Or I could be just speaking from my own ADD, but so little short snippets. But yeah, these 2 tunes were ones that I went as far as trying to recreate the recording, and they both live on my reference track list.
Yeah, and it is a beautiful intro to that track. It's a long time ago, isn't it? Track 3, and it's just him. And I think when I started listening to this on headphones, listened to it a few days ago and listened to it again today, and I went back and looked at my notes, and I just scribbled in the margin at the top of the first page, Sonic Bath. And it's like the whole
nice.
Is just like slipping into this sonic world. And I was talking to somebody else about this in the podcast recently, is I realized more and more when I put on a record, I sort of want to inhabit a self-contained world of sound. And it might be a symphony, it might be a solo guitar, it might be a jazz band, it might be a rock band. And we chatted briefly about that first Counting Crows record having that quality. You can find it.
Oh, did we mention that? Yeah, that's a good one.
I think I posted something on Instagram and you sort of commented on it. And it's just any kind of music can do it. But I like to be transported somehow into a sort of fully fleshed out sonic world. And this record just is one of those.
Yeah, actually, 2 quick thoughts. One, just backing up to this tune, I also made a note this morning that long time ago, the bass solo in that is just so great. And a lot of his bass solos are like this, and I think a lot of great solos are like this, where he just immediately just picks up the melody, and it's up the bass with a lot of slides and growl, and it's just... Actually, just even talking about it in technical terms just sort of takes away from what I'm really trying to say. I mean, it's just it's just this great emotional magic. Great bass solo. Secondly, yeah, that immersive experience and listening to a recording, I do think, like when we were talking about Kind of Blue earlier, that was like many people say that was one of the first jazz recordings where you could really hear the individual parts, and maybe one of the reasons why it's so great for repeated listening is if you decide you're going to do the exercise we described earlier of like, I'm just going to no matter what happens, I'm just going to focus on the drums this time through, or just, and it's right there for you. You can hear the sum of the parts, but then the individual parts are so separate. And I think part of that is, going with the Kind of Blue, when it was sort of a new idea to record things a little more closely, the individual instrument, not just the ensemble or the group within the ensemble, like the rhythm section or something. But also, the console and having the ability to take what's, put something on the left and put something on the right, and put something on the center. And with a trio, it just works so well, to have the bass up the middle and the guitars leaning to the right. To me, it sounds like it's at about 2:00 or 2:30 or something like that. And the mandolin feels like it's at like, 9:30 or something like that, which feels really great. My guess is they're in someone's dining room, right? So there's probably, the console may have been hard left and hard right, but it's all happening in the same room. So one is bleeding onto the other. And that's the same thing with Kind of Blue. And that also makes for that more of that. That's the sort of sonic glue, right? That that's the way you really hear things, right? Your left ear hears what's happening on the right side, and your right ear will have that sort of crosstalk. And yet still having a clear position in there is a big part. This is getting pretty nerdy, I'm sorry, but I love listening to albums.
Yeah, and I do. And I think it's the sign of a brilliant album in that you're able to talk about it in technical terms and able to like learn and try and recreate a section of one of the tracks as a technical exercise and still listen to the album like you've never heard it before and get swept away by it. And, that in itself is sort of testament to the depth of what's there on those grooves or that CD or, the zeros and ones on your phone.
It's like a great film, right? You can be watching it and just think, I can't believe the level of acting or the lighting, or my God, these are the, cliffs in Ireland that we're looking at on the big screen, whatever it is. You can get swept away with all the technical excellence and all of that. But if you're still thinking about that story when you wake up the next morning, you're still feeling the emotion of that story. That's a great film, in my opinion. It has that sort of residue. And yeah, this is one of those albums. And I just want to encourage people, guitar players, I guess a lot of guitar players out there, but also just anybody, bass players. This is just such a great record and such a great moment. And, as an old guy, someone who's taught guitar for like almost 40 years, it's important to listen. It's really, really important. I think I get a lot of young students and that's getting a little bit lost, this is my curmudgeon moment here, but it's easy to think, especially if you're a young guitar player, you can go on YouTube and the algorithm's like, here's 10 things you need to know and to be a great something in 8 minutes. I mean, that's quite a thing. Or, you could listen to an album like this, right? It's like a writer like who just is a ferocious reader, or a chef who's just grew up having amazing food in their home, or, if my son's listening, he'll cringe at me talking about sports, but I'm imagining like if you had a, basketball player just like doing, 10,000 hours of free throws, because at some point when it's time to actually do that thing, that imprint on your brain, it ups the ability of you to play music from the inside out. So much, it would be great if we could just learn 10 tips in 8 minutes or buy a new guitar or it would be great if it would all come from the outside in, but, to some degree it does, but this listening thing is really important and listen to albums, right? I'm not a big fan of playlists and stuff like that. I think it's so great to get immersed in, it's like a television show, like a 45-minute investment that you're going to just like, I'm going to go for a ride on this artist's, brain here for 45 minutes. It's just such a great thing. And it's one of the things that gets me the most excited in life. So, and this is one of them.
Well, and that's probably a pretty good place to think about wrapping up. But it's one of the reasons that I did an episode like this with Chris Eldridge about Bela Fleck's Drive record. And I enjoyed it so much, and he enjoyed it so much. I was like, right, I'm going to get some people back to talk about record. And I thought that maybe initially I'd say to people, pick a track, pick an album, pick an artist, and we'll talk about that. And I sort of quickly came round to the idea that it has to be an album. Like it has to be if somebody says and it's an artist and I'm not that familiar with them, that's way too much research for me to do. But it's also the idea of just talking for maybe 45 minutes about a 45-minute bit of music that becomes a companion to that and a chance to explore those things and to be immersed in one 45-minute choice of music rather than 10 4-minute choices of music or whatever. It's just put one thing on for 45 minutes and lose yourself in it. I think it feeds the soul. It's a good thing to do, and we don't slow down enough.
Yeah, this is our art form, you know. Well, I mean, I guess performing is too. I'm an album guy. I love albums, so this is our art form. So yeah, thanks for having me back.
Oh, it's been a treat. I've really, really enjoyed it. It's been an excuse to talk to you again, and it's been an excuse to just get my head into this record on a level that I haven't for ages.
Yeah, and congratulations on the success of this podcast too. IMBA Awards, Broadcaster of the Year. It's pretty cool, man. So keep on doing what you're doing.
Thank you. Oh, I'm having so much fun. It's going to be hard not to.
Great.
Great to see you again. Thank you.
Over and out.
Bluegrass Jam Along is proud to be sponsored by Collings Guitars and Mandolins, making some of the finest guitars and mandolins in the world since the 1970s. Visit collingsguitars.com and find out why.